small crowd came, and how much we appreciate the understanding of the intermountain states and just how critical these rules are to us.
Would you be interested in submitting that for the record?
Absolutely.
That letter? Without objection, so ordered. Question for Mr. Parker. Can you explain to me when a grazing permit is put in abeyance, put in a process that puts the grazing season at risk, how does that affect the value of base property, and what might be the banking consequences for a rancher if the value of their base property or their access to their grazing permit is impaired?
And as an agricultural economist, which is what I was trained, that's a tremendous question. As I have talked with ag lenders, the uncertainty that Congressman Bishop talked about is tremendous, and these operations generally have been developed at an economically viable level, and the uncertainty that's driven because of those decisions has an impact on their annual operating capital. It has an impact on their ability to pay their annual debt load that they have. As an example, down in southwestern Utah, where the wild horses and burros are out of control and being very mismanaged, those ranchers down there this grazing season as well as last received letters asking them to voluntarily cut 50% of their grazing. So that has an impact on their bottom line. They either have to remove them and find other pasture, or they have to feed them hay, and that's a very costly proposition. So any way you look at that equation and the loss of their ability to use the grazing rights that the Taylor Grazing Act gave them affects them and their ability to meet their debt load. Another point that I think is important here, Chairman, is that during those voluntary reductions, a lot of times those are the AUMs that I mentioned that are either non-use or suspended use. They never come back. They aren't officially cut, but the agencies never reinstitute them. The ranchers just have to absorb that loss.
Thank you. Ms. Budfellen, question on EJA, a subject that I know you have considerable expertise on. I'd like you to focus on the effects of EJA specifically on landowners and grazing.
Absolutely. The payment by the taxpayers of environmental groups to sue the federal government to take away their grazing rights is not the original intent of Congress under either EJA or under the Judgment Fund. As Mr. Sims said, the Equal Access to Justice Act and the Judgment Fund was passed to make payments from the courts to the agencies quicker and easier, and to protect small businesses. But what so often happens, and if you look at the chart that I included on page 8, and if you look at the litigation numbers, the numbers of cases that are filed by just the 4 environmental groups that I picked, litigation is expanding and payments are expanding. And so what happens is these groups sue the federal government to take away somebody's grazing permit, to list a threatened or endangered species, to do something that controls land use. The litigation is over the process, not over the science. The federal government, as you will see by my chart, in the vast, vast majority, settles the litigation. The permittee tries to intervene, so the permittee or the landowner pays his attorney to intervene in the litigation, pays for whatever time is in court by having to expend his energy, his effort, hire experts to defend his rights. pays for the federal government attorneys because our tax dollars are paying for the Justice Department to represent federal agencies, and we are paying for the federal agencies. And then we get to pay for the environmentalist attorney's fees as well. So the money all comes from us. And if you look at those numbers, I think that the numbers are staggering. Look at the attorney's fees paid via court decision. In all of those cases that I researched, 65 for Wild Earth Guardians, 39 for Western Watersheds, 155 lawsuits filed by Center for Biological Diversity, and 215 lawsuits filed by CBD in the last 4 years. 3 out of that entire total were payments by court decision. Every other payment was a settlement by the federal government, a settlement that Congress does not review and that the courts do not review. And it's all paid for by the people sitting in this audience and the people I represent.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now yield time to my chairman, Rob Bishop of the House Natural Resources Committee. But first, Rob, of course, I want you to talk about K through 12 education funding and federal lands.
Gee, thanks for that assignment. I appreciate it. I think what Cynthia also didn't tell you totally is we actually went on a mission together to meet with many of our Eastern friends back there, just to see if we can help explain the language, because we may be talking the same language, but we don't mean the same thing even though we're using the same words. So, for example, we did sit down at one time, I think you were there, maybe it was before that, with a senior member of Congress who asked us the difference between Forest Service and BLM lands. Now, that's a legitimate question, especially if you live back east. But it's not a legitimate question if you've been voting on those issues for the last 14 years. Yeah. So that was a question. So it was based on the premise that in the 1960s, the head of the Park Service thought if you could get more parks in more congressional districts, you could get more money. That's when national parks started to expand big time, and we were dumb enough to buy it. So today, there are national parks in all 50 states. Delaware finally found something worthy of a national park last year. But that also means that most people in Congress, when they talk about public lands or federal lands, they think of a national park. It's a pretty tree by a pretty lake. That's the concept. National parks only make up 13% of the estate of the federal government. 44% of everything government owns is BLM property. And BLM is not national park property. It doesn't look the same at all. And, as we all know, as you all know, because you have to live with it, BLM land is found always west of Denver. You don't have anything in the BLM east of Denver. There's nothing back there. So we tried to talk to some members. We sat down with members and said, okay, what kind of arguments can we use that make an impact on you? What will move you? Being fair with the West is the one that didn't move anybody. They could care less. The idea that the West has to be protected from itself is one of the myths of Washington. It still goes in their minds. But there were two things that did make a difference to them, and so we're trying to emphasize these more and more. First off, if you add all the revenue that we receive from federal lands, the federal government receives from federal lands, and you subtract everything that we spend on maintenance, control, regulation on federal lands, including SRS and PILT, Easterners are coming up with about $8 to $10 billion a year out of their pockets to try and subsidize the role of the federal government in controlling Western lands. So what we're trying to tell them is, look, we'll make you a deal. If you let us control our own destiny and you can keep your money, that's one of the things they considered. That made a difference. The other dealt with education. So if you look at a map of the states that have the hardest time increasing their funding for public education, you will find, and you look at a map where most of the federal land is, you'll find that the federal land states are indeed the ones that have a hard time funding their education, and significantly. So over the past 20 years, the federal land states, and for me that's everything from the Rocky Mountains west, everyone has a significant amount of federal land, has grown their education funding over the past 20 years by 32%, which seems pretty good. But if you look at the states that are east of that, with almost no federal lands, total number is 4% of all is federal property. They've grown theirs by 78%. It is twice the rate. So I'm an old school teacher. My salary was always, I think, underrepresented because the state just doesn't have the money to do it. Because everything is tied up in federal lands, which have no property tax. But also, if there is no development of those lands, the subsidiary groups, service groups that help to drive those industries, they're not growing, so they're not paying income tax or any other kind of tax. There's no royalty payments that are coming through, no severance tax, all those types of things, if the federal lands are not being allowed to try and have some kind of economic benefit. And those of us in the West are doing it. So I said my salary is always hurt, my retirement for education. Worse, the tuition I had to pay for my 5 kids to go to college was always higher, simply because the West is prohibited. Now, the bottom line is the United States today is an energy-producing giant. We have surpassed Saudi Arabia in the amount of energy we produce. And it's all done, as you well know, on state and private lands. And instead, what has happened on federal lands is a huge decrease in the amount of lands that are even open up for bid, let alone allowed to go through the process to come up with it. So it simply means if indeed there's going to be economic development from the lands, not only in grazing, but also in fossil fuel industries, and in tourism. I'm sorry, the federal government doesn't do a great job in tourism either. If you all don't want to do any of those, you're going to have to change the dynamic of how we see it. And how the ownership of federal lands in the West harms our kids and harms our ability to fund education is another thing that they will consider in the East and go, oh, I didn't realize that. That makes sense. Those, to me, are the 2 arguments we have to be using in the future, and that's what we've been trying to do and let people know. So, to me, as far as our committee, we also have now changed the names of everything. We no longer have public lands, we have a federal lands subcommittee. To me, there is a difference between public and federal lands. Public lands, like with the West, we've always been public land states. We'll always be public land states. But for public lands, in my mind, means the people who live in that area make the decision of how those public lands will be used. Federal lands are those that are controlled by Washington. Limit what the federal lands are and allow public lands to take place and allow them to be used for the benefit of people. And that's what Cynthia and I did, is we were going around to certain groups trying to use pictures, which we should have brought. If I'd known you wanted pictures, we would have brought pictures. But I'm sure you know exactly what we're talking about. Can I ask a couple questions? And you know, there are so many. I know. Can I start with Ms. Butt-Fallon, if I could, because you've been there before. I appreciate your talk of Egypt. Every time we talk about some kind of change to Egypt, and we did that in the Healthy Forest Act that we just passed. There were some changes to that concept. It's always used as this red herring that we're taking away the rights of poor whistleblowers to have their day in court. I think what you're saying here, and especially the chart, is this EJA is not being used by poor, hardworking individuals. It's being used by rich special interest groups. Is that correct?
Yes, and I can give you examples in the chart. If you look...
Do we know how much we're actually spending?